Hi, good evening dear students. In yesterday class, I discussed about the four types of vector, that is the unit vector, null vector, equal vector and negative vector. Already know definition of that four vectors and its representation also. In today's session, I am going to explain few more types of vectors. Fifth one, concurrent vectors. Fifth one, concurrent vector. Concurrent vector. Okay, this one is the fifth one type of a vector. Okay, what is the definition of a concurrent vector? When we are said to be vector should be concurrent or vector will be concurrent. ಯಾವಾಗ ನಾವು ಕಾನ್ಕರೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೇವೆ. ಇದು ಐದನೆಯ ವಿಧ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ನ ಐದನೇ ವಿಧ. ಕಾನ್ಕರೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಯಾವಾಗ ಕರಿತೀವಪ್ಪ ಅಂತಂದಾಗ ದ ನಂಬರ್ ಆಫ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಎಟ್ ಎ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್, ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಕಾಮನ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್. ಎಲ್ಲ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸು ಒಂದು ಕಾಮನ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟಿಗೆ ಮೀಟ್ ಐತೆ ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಕಾನ್ಕರೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಡೆಫಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾನ್ಕರೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್? ಎ ನಂಬರ್ ಆಫ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ acting at a point are called as concurrent vectors. A definition: a number of vectors acting at a number of vectors acting at a point are called concurrent vectors. How to show diagrammatically of the concurrent vectors? Observe here, this one is the one point. I am considering a point, particular point. On this common point, number of vectors are acting. For example, this one is a P vector acting at a point O, or this one is a Q vector acting at a point O. This one is a R vector acting at a point. It means number of vectors, different vectors acting at a common point, that we are called as concurrent vectors. Next, number 6 one, coplanar vector. Planar vector. When we are said to be vector is coplanar, ನಾವು ಯಾವಾಗ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ನ ಕೋಪ್ಲೇನಾರ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಓಕೆ, ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದ ಡೆಫಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಕೋಪ್ಲೇನಾರ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್? ಡೆಫಿನೇಷನ್: ಎ ನಂಬರ್ ಆಫ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಇನ್ ಎ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಪ್ಲೇನ್. Number of vectors acting in a plane is called as coplanar vectors. Definition: a number of vectors acting in a plane number of vectors acting in a plane are called are called coplanar vector. Definition: a number of vectors acting in a plane. Number of vectors acting in a plane are called as coplanar vectors. A number of vectors acting in a plane are called as coplanar vectors. Observe here, this one is a point, B point and C point. This one is a vectors. Here co nothing but common planar vector. The name only indicates common planar vector. For that all the vectors having a common line. This one is called as coplanar vectors. Number of vectors acting on a plane. Different types of vector acting in a particular plane. This one is called as plane. This one plane we call as coplanar vectors. What is the definition of coplanar vector? A number of vector acting in a plane are called as coplanar vector. Okay, this one is the sixth one type of vector also over. The next one, seventh one. Seventh one vector, parallel vectors. Parallel vectors. That vectors which have the lines of action parallel to each other. The number of vectors moving parallel with each other. Okay, one vector its line parallel with the another vector. Such a vector called as parallel vectors. Definition: vectors which have their lines of action parallel to each other are called parallel vectors. Parallel vectors. Vectors which have their lines of action parallel with each other. Okay, it is also similar to the positive vectors. The next one, number 8. Eighth one type. Number 8. Co-initial vectors. So what is the definition of co-initial vector? Co nothing but common initial vectors. Suppose two vectors moving in a different direction. Okay, when they are moving in different direction means that should have common initial point. Okay, ಎರಡು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಡಿಫರೆಂಟ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಮೂವ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಅವೆರಡು ಏನಾಗಿರಬೇಕು, ಕಾಮನ್ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಅನ್ನು ಇರಬೇಕು. ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ದಿಸ್ ಒನ್ ಇಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಅ ಕಾಮನ್ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್. ಅದೇಂತು ಅಂತೀನಿ ಕಾಮನ್ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್. ಫ್ರಮ್ ದಿಸ್ ಒನ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ one vector moving this side, okay, another vector moving this side. This is considered as an P vector and this one is a Q vector. The angle between them is considered as an theta. Okay, these two vectors having common initial point. Such a vectors we call as co-initial vector. ಪಿ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಈ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ಗಿದೆ, ಕ್ಯೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಈ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಎರಡೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಏನಾಗಿದೆ, ಸೇಮ್ ಇದೆ, ಕಾಮನ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಕೋ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಟೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ಸೆಡ್ ಟು ಬಿ ಕೋ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್. ಡೆಫಿನೇಷನ್: two vectors are said to be co-initial if they have a common initial point are called co-initial vectors. Okay, different vector having a common initial point, such a vector we call as co-initial vector. Okay, next one, ninth one, resultant vector. Ninth one, resultant vector. Resultant vector. What is the definition of resultant vector? It is a single vector. Resultant vector, it is a single vector. It is a single vector. It is a single vector which can produce the same effect, It is the single vector which can produce the same effect which is produced by same effect which is produced by all those vectors acting together. All those vectors acting together are called resultant vectors. Okay, it is a resultant vector, a resultant addition of two vectors or more vectors. Okay, when we are said to be vector or addition, vectors are subtraction, vectors are multiplication, it means resultant of two vector. Okay, it's resultant. It means number of vectors converted into single forms. Definition: it is a single vector. Resultant vector, it is a single vector. I am considering this resultant vector, it is an R vector. It is a single vector. R vector, it is a single vector which can produce the same effect which is produced by all those vectors acting together are called as resultant vector. For example, I am considering this one is a P vector. Okay, along that same line another vector, a Q vector. What are the addition of this one vector? R vector is equal to P vector plus Q vector. Okay, for example, P vector, it is an 5 meter. Q vector, it is also 5 meter. What is the total distance here? 10 meter. 10 it is a resultant. 5 plus 5 it is a vector sum of the two individual vectors. Observe here, 10 it is a single vector, that is called as resultant vector. A resultant vector is the vector which produce the same effect of all the vectors together. All the vectors together means vector sum of the two vectors. It gives the resultant vector. That resultant vector and vector sum of two vectors are same. That one you call as resultant vector. ರಿಸಲ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಯಾವಾಗ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅಂತಂದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಪಿ ವೆಕ್ಟರು ಮತ್ತು ಕ್ಯೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರೇಷನ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಆ ಎರಡರನ್ನು ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊರಿ. ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಬರೋ ರಿಸಲ್ಟ್ ಏನು? ರಿಸಲ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ವೆನ್ ವಿ ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಟು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇಟ್ ಗಿವ್ಸ್ ದ ನ್ಯೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ದಟ್ ನ್ಯೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಯು ಕಾಲ್ ಆಸ್ ರಿಸಲ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ನಂಬರ್ 10. 10th one. Orthogonal unit vector. Orthogonal unit vector. Orthogonal unit vector. So what is the definition of orthogonal unit vector? Orthogonal unit vector ಅಂತ ಯಾವಾಗ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ನಾವು? Dear students, already you know the rectangular coordinate system. In that rectangular coordinate system, we are considered the three axes. One is the x-axis, another is the y-axis, and last one is the z-axis. ಈಗ ಆರ್ಥೋಗೋನಲ್ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಯಾವಾಗ ಕರಿತೀವಪ್ಪ ಅಂತಂದಾಗ ರೆಕ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಗ್ಯುಲರ್ ಕೋಆರ್ಡಿನೇಟ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು 3 ಆಕ್ಸಿಸ್ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರೇಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಓಕೆ, ದಿಸ್ ಒನ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಒರಿಜಿನ್. ಫ್ರಮ್ ದಟ್ ಒರಿಜಿನ್, ಫ್ರಮ್ ಇಟ್ ಫಿಕ್ಸ್ಡ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್, we are considering 3 axes. This one is the x-axis and y-axis, z-axis. For that 3 axes, O it is a one common point. That 3 are mutually perpendicular with each other. ಈ ಮೂರು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಏನಾಗಿದೆ? ಮ್ಯೂಚುವಲಿ ಪರ್ಪೆಂಡಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. And O2 along x-axis, O2 along x-axis and O2 along y-axis and O2 along z-axis, z side, we are giving one a position vector. Okay, that position vector is considered as an unit vectors. Along O2x, I am considering unit vector, that is the I cap. ಏನು ತೋಡಿದ್ವಿ? I cap ಅಂತ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರೇಷನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. I cap it is a unit vector along which axis? X-axis. J cap it is a unit vector along y-axis. K cap it is a unit vector along z-axis. Okay, O2x I cap, O2y j cap, O2z k cap. Okay, these are the unit vectors. Definition of this one. Definition: in a rectangular coordinate system, in a rectangular coordinate system, comma, the unit vectors along x-axis, the unit vectors along x-axis, comma, y-axis and z-axis. Observe here, in that rectangular coordinate system along x-axis, unit vector I am considering I cap, y-axis j cap, z-axis k cap. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ರೆಕ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಗ್ಯುಲರ್ ಕೋಆರ್ಡಿನೇಟ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು 3 ಆಕ್ಸಿಸ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಯೂನಿಟ್ಸ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ನೇಮಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ. ಅಲಾಂಗ್ ಓ ಎಕ್ಸ್ ಏನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ವಿ? ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಐ ಕ್ಯಾಪ್, ಓ ವೈ ಜೆ ಕ್ಯಾಪ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಓ ಜೆಡ್ ಕೆ ಕ್ಯಾಪ್ ರೆಸ್ z axis or are I cap, comma, j cap and k cap are mutually perpendicular, k cap respectively, since the unit vectors I cap, comma, j cap and k cap are mutually perpendicular to each other. They are called orthogonal vectors. Then okay, dear students, next one, 11th one, polar vectors. What is the definition of polar vector? The vector whose direction is along the direction of motion. A vector whose direction is along the direction of motion. Along the direction of motion. ಯಾವ ಒಂದು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ನ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ನು ಆ ಒಂದು ವಸ್ತುವಿನ ಚಲನೆಯ ದಿಕ್ಕಿಗೆ ಇರುತ್ತೋ ಅದಕ್ಕೇನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಪೋಲಾರ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್, ಎನಿ ಒನ್ ಬಾಡಿ ಮೂವ್ ಇನ್ ಎ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್, ದಟ್ ಮೋಷನ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ that are same. That vectors whose direction is along the direction of motion. Body will be propagating or it is under motion, its direction also same side. That is called as polar vectors. Example, displacement, ಸ್ಥಾನ ಪಲ್ಲಟ, displacement, velocity, acceleration, etc. These all are the polar vectors. And last one, 12th one, axial vectors. 12th one, axial vectors. A vector whose direction along the axis of rotation. A vector whose direction is along the axis of rotation. Are called axial vectors. For example, any one object it rotating in a circular path. ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ವಸ್ತು circular path ಅಲ್ಲಿ rotate ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ತಿಳ್ಕೊರಿ. From this rotating body, one fixed axis is there. Fixed axis. Okay, when we say to be vector is an axial, a vector whose direction, either the direction, for example, a particle rotating in a circular path through Kori. Okay, its direction is along the axis of rotation. ಓಕೆ, ಯಾವಾಗ ಬಾಡಿ ಸುತ್ತ ತಿರುಗುತ್ತಿದೆ ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊರಿ, ಅದರದ್ದು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಯಾವ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ತೋರಿಸ್ತೀವಿ, ಆಕ್ಸಿಸ್ ಆಫ್ ರೊಟೇಷನ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ಗೆ ತೋರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ವಿ ಆರ್ ಶೋಯಿಂಗ್ ದ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಅಲಾಂಗ್ ದ ಆಕ್ಸಿಸ್ ಆಫ್ ರೊಟೇಷನ್. That one you call as axial vectors. Example for that axial vectors, one is the angular velocity, angular velocity, angular velocity, angular velocity, and second one angular acceleration, angular acceleration. Okay, these are the examples for the axial vectors. What is the definition of angular velocity? That velocity of a body along a circular path. It changes the displacement with respect to time along a circular path. You call it angular velocity. It is denoted with symbol omega. Okay. Up to here, types of vectors over. Thank you.